People were, the subject of play is always, it's been one of my pet interests for many, many years. And, I decided to just do it because because after close to 15 years of doing these lectures, I'm beginning to run out of topics. So it's always a challenge to me to think of something a little new or different. Although I guess I'm about ready to recycle some of this stuff that I did 10 or 12 years ago. But so this is the subject that I've been.
Oh, is Dr. Schiff going to be on? Or?
I think so. We'll see. Should I call him now? Might as well see if he's up. We should have a phone hookup to Seattle.
You can just push.
Okay.
Hold on.
If Dr. Schiff, who tends to get up around 6 o'clock in the morning, usually should be there. See if he's there. Hi, you're there. We were debating, because I didn't speak to you last night, so I wasn't sure we figured you'd be hanging around. All right. Okay, so we're about to get started. We have a nice group of some new people. A big Sarah Lawrence contingent who know Posey, so so give her a heads up on that. At any rate, why don't we go on to speakerphone, and then I'm just about to get started. Okay. So what do I do? Put it back on?
Push the orange button first.
Okay. You got it?
I'm here.
Okay.
Morning.
Morning. Okay, so as I said, this has been a topic that's really always has been sort of a pet topic of mine for years, an interest of mine for years, and I decided to do this. I didn't know how much interest there would be in it, and obviously there's a lot more interest than I anticipated. A number of people who couldn't be here today called and expressed interest, so that's great. I mean, actually I had at various times planned to do, and still have outlines for my work at the New School, trying to launch a course on the study of play in humans and other animals. But let me make a couple of comments here. I'm emphasizing this, viewing this from a orgonomic perspective, which in my terms, and I think Dr. Schiff would agree with me, is largely a question of looking at it energetically. And I think one of the great failures in the study of play is a failure to really understand the underlying energetic function of play in organisms. And I think it's partly my contention that if one understands any behavior energetically, it begins to take on a broader relationship to human or to living function. The great problem in studies of play has been that it's very sporadic, it's very, very erratic in terms of how play is studied or looked at. And there's no unifying understanding of what play is. So the first thing I want to do is give you a somewhat basic history of the study of play. And that's one of the things I enjoy, is that it's very easy. It's not a long, torturous history, because in fact there has been almost virtually no serious study of play from a biological and systemic perspective. The tendency is to study play largely as a phenomena that is adjunctive to growing up, and certainly in Western tradition, play is to the extent that it's taken seriously at all, has tended to be clinically formed and looked at as essentially a clinical problem for study. Clinical meaning the study of play in children, and particularly the development of play therapy. Okay? So then when we look at key figures like Winnicott and the early development of play therapy, Marilyn E. Klein, even Anna Freud, the tendency is to see play as a way of understanding or getting into the psyche or the emotional lives of children. And so that when one goes to look at the literature on play in any major library, you're going to often encounter books that purport to be on the nature of play really being studies of what play means in terms of the emotional life of children and how to use that to understand children's normal behavior as well as pathological behavior. That's not the kind of play that I'm particularly interested in. I mean, I've certainly been trained in my various clinical trainings in how to use play to work with children, but that hasn't been what I am interested in when it comes to the issue of play. Back in the 1950s, the serious study of play really emerges pretty much in the 1950s, although we have some proto studies and some proto ideas about play as a central biological function in the work of Darwin, in his book on the expression of emotions in animals and man, and then also in the work of Konrad Lorenz in terms of looking at animal behavior. The nature of play and the function of play is noted as a distinctive behavior in many and certain particular species. However, it's really not until the 1950s, right? And I'm not ignoring Reich. I'll get to Reich's role in this, although he doesn't have a central critique on play, but I think there's enough in Reich's work to clearly come to a critique or develop a critique based on his ideas. But in the 1950s, anthropologist, psychologist, photographer, sort of a polymorph named Gregory Bateson, who many of you might know. He's not so popular now, but these days, if he's well known, he's usually well known as having been married to Margaret Mead. But one of those who was married to Margaret Mead. But Bateson was a very fascinating, probably more brilliant than Mead, really, although much more sort of scattered. Bateson was a great photographer, a brilliant mathematician, and a absolutely brilliant naturalist. And it's in his work as a naturalist. He's also the guy who developed cybernetics, really laid the groundwork for what became essentially the language of computers. It's Bateson who introduces the ideas of analog and digital, and he's really quite brilliant, protean figure. But one of the lesser known little contributions was there was a series of lectures. I don't know if they still go on, but for many years there was a very important series of lectures, seminars that were held called the Macy Lectures, which were sponsored by one of the wealthy Macy figures. And this brought together it was like a think tank. And one of the, in I think 55, they held this gigantic symposium on play. And they had a number of panels. And Bateson gave a seminal talk at one of the panels with a number of other people present, but actually when you read the transcription, it's mostly Bateson. The other people occasionally make, I think Edmund O. Wilson was there, they occasionally make comments, but Bateson really took off. And Bateson's talk was called The Message, and then in quotes, "This is play." And what Bateson started out with was the fascinating observation that we all know, which is two dogs are walking down the street, and they approach each other, and they start barking and growling, but the dogs, without any question, know that it's play. Although by most observations to the outside observer, particularly humans, they're not sure, and you get nervous. And yet the dogs have no problem understanding that this is play. On the other hand, two dogs approach each other and know instantly it's not play, it's death, or it's ignoring. And they have these particularly very ritualized gestures. But Bateson became fascinated with how animals can distinguish between what is play and then what is not play. The next question is, when you look at the question of what is play versus what is not play, leads you to the really central problem in play research, which is why I suspect most people don't do it, which is how we don't have it. If I ask this group, I'll ask this group, what is play? You all know what play is. You all know when you're playing. We all know when we're playing, right? But if I ask you to define what play is, what would you say?
Making believe.
Making believe. That's probably some aspect of play, but I can make believe that I'm, going to rob a bank and kill 5 or 6 people and have a fantasy about that. Is that play? You know.
I'd say maybe spontaneous, free-flowing exchange of energy. I don't know, maybe between another person always, or just yourself.
That probably has some validity, but we could construct situations in which there are spontaneous, free-flowing. When one does work, or when one puts on a play, or a dance, there's a spontaneous, free-flowing of energy that goes on. Although, granted, it becomes organized, but you would argue that almost any kind of play situation becomes organized too.
It comes out of expansion, it's unrestrained expansion to some extent, it's part of that, but
Yeah,
I guess I would ask, does play always have to be pleasurable? Because I'm thinking just sort of any activity that's pleasurable can be play, can be done playfully.
Mm-hmm.
About learning. I mean, when you see 2 lion cubs and they're playing together, they're also learning how to stalk and learn skills for later on.
Right.
I watch kittens and cats, they do, that's exactly what they do.
All of this is absolutely true, and what happens is, and we could go on and on. I mean, I could say that I know there are a couple people here who are involved in theater. When one works in theater, one certainly works with most of these issues that have been put out here already, and yet the object is, while there might be elements of playfulness and elements of energetic flow and expansion, the object is not to frolic and play. The object is to produce a finished or defined work. So that what really emerges, and as I said, we could spend, if this was a seminar, we could spend extensive time examining and exploring, and I would love to at some point if I had the opportunity, really explore the nature of these contentions. But the interesting thing is that in every situation when I present this question, and not only I, when Bateson did, and when anyone else who was really interested in this subject presents this question, it's very, very hard to get people to come up with a clearly succinct and simple explanation of what play is that satisfies all of our inherent expertise on play. Because the other thing is that all of us, ironically, while we have a hard time exactly coming up with an intricate and precise definition, all of us are experts to some extent on play, and we know what play is, and we know, as the dogs do, when the message is that this is play. Okay? Although, clearly, and what gets interesting from an issue of pathology is sometimes there are miscues. So, one can have a fight with one's mate by you think you're being playful and making some just silly playful comment, and he or she doesn't. They take it quite seriously, and then suddenly it's not play, and you're saying, but I was just playing around. And it's not play, it's serious, and it's hurtful, and it becomes... So it is clearly a complex dynamic. For me, what began to become interesting is that my suspicion was that because it's so difficult to clearly define it or come up with a very simple definition, is that the answer lies in the fact that it is probably a deeply central function in the organism. And that as a result of that, there isn't a simple description of what it is, even though we all know when it is operating and when we are experiencing it. So that it's not so much that it's hard to define. It's that it is so deeply pervasive and deeply, suffused through our overall functioning, right? On a literally a daily basis, on a lifetime basis, that is one of those things that becomes hard to exactly distill out and create a clear sense of artifact that this is what we're looking at and this is what we're studying. As a result of that, it becomes increasingly complex about how you are to, if you can't really come up with a simple definition, it becomes even harder to set up a discipline to study it. Since the 1950s, there have been a slow growth of individuals, particularly in natural sciences, anthropology, physical psychology, and to some degree biology, who are beginning to look at it. What's fascinating when one does research in play, in the biology of play, or the physiology, or the actual function of play, the literature search is fairly easy. There are only, a small number of key researchers and key people, and most of the work is very erratic in the sense that there are periods of time. Back in the 50s, there was a little flurry of interest produced by Bateson, and then in the 60s, of course, which was a decade of play to some extent, or interest in play, there was some more work, although a lot of it was not very well organized, as with many things in the 60s. And then since then, there have been growing interest in it from a purely mechanical study, and so that there have been a growing number of individuals who have been looking at it from a animal behavior perspective. Actually, one of Dr. Schiff's students, associates, young woman out in originally in Seattle. She might be I'm not sure where. Michelle Buchanan, who was from Seattle, is now teaching. Basically, heard my lecture about play out in Seattle about 15 years ago, and saying that if I were young and going into research, that's where I would go to do my doctorate. And she actually took it up, and it's this kind of student we all dream of finding. She actually took it up and became a researcher in play. And has done extensive, in fact, some of my presentations based on an initial paper she did on an orgonomic overview of the study of play. But basically, even she points out in her basic presentation that there isn't a lot of literature, and most of the literature was really generated by animal behaviorists. So that said, and today, of course, there's not a lot of money. I'll pass this around. There was an article about, I guess this is now maybe 10 years old. I keep thinking it was just a few years ago, but then I look at dates and discover that it was really 10, 15 years ago. This was from National Geographic in 1994. But in some sense, this is just some one. This was in the 1990s. There was a sudden flurry of interest in the study of play, and a number of people began to look at it, and it got enough interest so that National Geographic did a big spread on it. And I pass that around because it's some nice pictures of various animals at play. It starts off with a very interesting presentation of observation of a polar bear near a town, who would come down and actually, rather than eat the sleigh dogs, would actually wind up playing with them, and that the dogs understood that he was coming to play. The problem again is, as the author points out, it's hard to understand why these behaviors, operate, or how they operate, and how the communication takes place. And the general response of most play research, to the extent that there is even any serious play research in animals and humans, is to assume that they are specific expressions of generalized and sometimes specific behaviors in the species. So the argument, for instance, why these polar bears didn't eat the sleigh dogs was that it was the time of year when these polar bears were well fed, and half sleepy, so that they weren't into eating sleigh dogs. They didn't have to, so they were into sort of rolling around and playing. I'm not 100% convinced that it's that simple, although we have to look at the fact that animal behaviors are not necessarily projections of human assumptions about what behavior are. So that when a dog licks your face, there's definitely some sort of communication and interaction, but you can't assume that the dog is licking your face because it likes you. I mean, you can assume that, but it's not necessarily the case. We know more behaviorally that most dogs lick faces because that's how they get food from their parent, their mother or the adults when they're begging for food. But as Bateson points out, and as later John Bowlby, the child psychologist and human behaviorist who wrote Attachment, points out, that we are free, I think, to look at other animal behaviors, and if we see patterns of behavior that are consistent with other behaviors that we display as humans, that we can begin to make some broad generalizations about the function of these behaviors. And so clearly when one looks at animals, what we see, I think very clearly, is that play serves, and a number of you, when you started struggling with the issue of what play is, many, I guess it's been a product of the growth of this in literature and in study, are beginning to be more sophisticated about what play does in animals and humans alike. So that what we begin to see that play has this central role. The question then is, what is the role? Okay. The general range of studies in play in animals is to see the role largely as essentially a way of the animals becoming more coordinated, practicing other social roles. The standard line is that you're practicing those things and triggering hormonal releases and muscular development, and on a larger scale in more social animals like primates, you're triggering social behaviors and practicing social behaviors that will become central to your adult function. Okay? The problem with that, as Bateson pointed out as early as 1955, was that very often when you seriously look at animals, and then Kellogg pointed this out, and then also Jane Goodall pointed this out, is that you very often look at a wide range of animals who don't seem to just play to exercise skills, and then don't always play at moments that make any particular sense, so that it doesn't seem to be as simple a situation as the animal is doing this in order to organize and mechanically learn the things it's going to need in practice to be an adult. That very, very often play in animals seems to be quite spontaneous, not necessarily triggered by any clear stimulus in the environment, and that doesn't necessarily lead to any productive gain immediately. However, when we look at play long term, what becomes interesting is that the failure to play, animals that don't play, develop profound retardation developmentally. So that, and that clearly animals, and not just humans, who have restricted or deformed play experiences as they develop profound range of pathology. And there's no question. There have been some very interesting studies, for instance, actually this guy who wrote this article did a very interesting study of looking at serial killers and speaking to them, and discovering that invariably all of these people had in common the fact that they had extremely restricted or non-existent play experiences as children. That they didn't play, and that if they did play at all, the games or the nature of the play was always very aggressive, very sadistic, very, very predatory, and very violent. Okay. Interesting, he went further, which was very, very.
Is that always environmental? because of environmental reasons?
Well, I think usually, inevitably, it was because, most of these kids were also abused. They were isolated. They were kept in situations where there were very, very limited directions or places for play or for play or play to express itself. Interestingly, he went further and researched people who were arrested for drunk driving and vehicular homicides or accidents, right? And in studying those and doing profiles on those, they also had, now whether that relates to drunk driving in play or whether that relates to alcoholism in play, I suspect it's, the drunk driving was the result of, the fact that they were alcoholics. So it was interesting, he didn't say that, but my immediate assumption was that it was probably reflective of the fact that people who become alcoholics in general probably also have some sort of deformity or problem in their developmental process as children with play. Although you'd have to do, these are all speculations, because the problem is we don't have a broad database and research, so there's some suggestive information. Certainly clinically from my own experience, the alcoholics I've worked with invariably when they're not drinking are not very playful. They can often be very playful when they're drinking. It's as if the alcohol in some way allows for a kind of, or gives a kind of, removal of inhibition and release in a way that allows for variety of play-like behaviors, although obviously at a particular cost. So I think these are all very, very specific and interesting operations. The classic animal behavior understanding of play has emerged that animals play in order to coordinate and organize physical dexterity, physical traits. So the classic, which he goes into in this National Geographic article, is cats cornering a baby. In this case, I think it's a baby eland, deer-like creature, and obviously play rather than killing it. For 2 or 3 hours, they play with it. They circle it. They bang it. They let it run. Now here's the question. This is play for the cats, right? Is it play for the eland? And that's. We laugh at that, but in a sense, those are the complex questions about what happens when you study play. Okay, does play require, that all parties engaged in the play are agreeable to the fact that this is play? So that if you're playing with a mouse because you're a cat and for you it's great fun, right? Is the mouse your playmate? We laugh at this because obviously not, but it is a particularly complex question. In this instance of the cheetahs, young cheetahs playing, playing with this eland, the mother finally steps in after a couple of hours of this play and basically does what you're supposed to do, which is she suffocates it by biting its neck and kills it, and then it becomes food. Now at the point that the mother does that, it's no longer play. Okay. And we laugh uncomfortably with that because those distinctions are fairly clear, right? But this is the nature of play study today, to the extent that it exists, that there are people looking at this. Let me sort of come to this conclusion, then I'll take some credit. What is missing for me in most of this research, while I find it, endlessly fascinating, endlessly engaging, and I read lots and lots and lots of this because it's, and I watch the Discovery Channel and I watch the Animal Channel because it's all very, it's fun, it's play. It's informative, it's interesting. What is missing is a unifying understanding of what's going on in all of these situations. And what it seems to me Orgonomy, or Reich's work, offers is a more fundamental understanding of what the nature and function of play is in living organisms. And I think Christine alluded to that when she began to talk about, and a couple of you did when we talked about, it's not surprising in this group that people that know that energy is an issue, and energy is something that we come back to constantly. But it seems to me that the general function principle here is that underlying this is that organisms have to regulate themselves. So it comes back to the fundamental principle of energetic function and pulsation. I guess which all things do, especially in these lectures. Okay, so that if we come back to, as Dr. Schiff likes to always point out, to this energetic function, and for Dr. Schiff, who I assume is still there. Are you there?
I'm here.
Okay. Of pulsation, energetic pulsation, which is expansion and contraction, that what all of these complex range of issues center around is that the organism has to and will, any organism, whether it's a cheetah, whether it's a kitten, a monkey, a human being, is pulsating. And that the natural process of expansion and contraction are necessary operations in that organism's living function. And in order for that to be maintained, there has to be a continual interaction and a continual setting for that. And more importantly, what we understand increasingly, and what Reich really I think was very clear about, is that kind of effective pulsation can only really reach a maximum function when it is in the context of other energy fields and other pulsatory organisms. So that in one sense, what this leads me to hypothesize, and clearly cannot, except anecdotally, support this, because I don't have large-scale research grant or whatever, is that what play is fundamentally is the interaction of two or more pulsating organisms in a attempt to regulate or self-regulate their need to expand and contract and deal with that process, and to become ultimately comfortable with that, or become ultimately capable of maintaining effective pulsatory function and interaction with others who are also pulsatory, and that requires continual practical experience. And what play provides is an ideal situation in which one can explore the nature of pulsatory interactions, as I've come to call them. Now that leads, in a very interesting way, to one of the final things in the general presentation that I want to make, is that we have to then question what's the difference between play and work, what's the difference between play and sex or sexuality, or is there a difference? Right? We would tend in our experience to say that there is a difference, and what is it? I would sort of throw that as a question. What do you think the difference is?
Work is not pleasurable, as we experience.
Well, I mean, maybe if you're working for the Board of Ed, as you do.
It doesn't mean it cannot be
Right.
pleasurable.
Right. Well, rather than going to the deformation of work, which is basically as an unpleasurable, and I think that's important, because one of the early comments that Reich talks about back in the sex pole essays, and certainly in the function of the orgasm, is the fact, and character analysis, is the fact that most people experience work as a highly unpleasurable, highly demoralizing and degrading experience, right? But Reich is very clear that is a pathological development, and a pathological development both individually, but one that becomes profoundly supported in a compulsive social environment that basically demoralizes work or degrades work, okay? And that what Reich always, I think, brilliantly asks is that there's got to be a reason for that. What does society, what does the social situation gain for degrading work? And one of the answers would be that it clearly then restricts the ability for a free, operative, pulsatory expression. it prevents work from being a pleasure. And in the process, it makes work very, very, so if I say in any kind of society that we live in to distinguish work from play, most of us would say, oh, this is work and this is play, right? Okay? And work would not be fun. It might be interesting at best if we're really lucky, but it would not be what, it would be different than play because it's not fun. It's restrictive. It's tense. It's fraught with all sorts of potential pitfalls and difficulties and problems. Whereas play is free, easy. No penalties, no real negatives. Okay. But in fact, play and work in nature, even if we study hunters and gatherers and humans in nature, play and work are not that, the distinctions are not that clear in non-Western or non-compulsive societies. So the question is, whether there is as big a distinction about work, and I think there are ways of understanding work as different than play. And I think clearly one of the main differences, if we look at humans or animals in nature, play behaviors do not necessarily have any other purpose other than the behavior and the pleasure in and the basic excitation and discharge of energy and the experience of pleasure. Whereas work, while it can follow the same arc, has as it's goal-directed. Play is not goal-directed. So that becomes, I think, very important distinction. But it doesn't have to be different than work. It just has to have a different goal or different or different direction. Okay? Secondly, the question then gets more interesting if we look at play in relationship to sexuality or sexual function, right? In terms of definitions, that gets more, problematic because certainly, I think we could apply the issue of goal-directed behavior there because, as Bates, Bates and also as John Bowlby would say, these are goal-directed behaviors because sex, unlike play, does have a goal-directed behavior, which is the specific merging of two organisms and the discharge in a full orgasmic function. But certainly play probably has a similar, a similar function in most organisms. So whether you can distinguish, okay, as simply between work and play, between sexuality and play, becomes, I think, much, much more complex and much, much more grayer in and around the edges. However, the problem then comes back to, it seems to me, how the particular environment allows for play, and whether play is allowed to freely express itself, and whether play, in orgonomic terms, whether play is genital play, not mean play with the genitals, but genital in terms of the full flow of energy in the organism, or whether play is basically directed play, which is like, this is okay for play, but this is not okay for play. We don't play that way, we play this way. In most of our educational experiences with play, most schools, most learning experiences, and to some extent even in our playgrounds and stuff when we take our kids out, there's very, very clear messages about what is acceptable play and what is not acceptable play, so that it gets to be a question of how you begin to organize and how you begin to restrict and direct the nature of play. And I would argue that it's very, very much preparatory to how you will, in your society, begin to define sexuality. So the link, it seems to me, between play and sexual function or orgasmic function or energetic function is crucial. And so that while work and play might have some broader, more characteristic differences, albeit not probably as extensive as they might initially appear, play and sexuality are probably functionally identical. In my view, that they are, in using Reich's idea of functional identity, that they are simply different expressions of the same thing. And if you look for what they are different expressions of, is essentially the self-regulation of energetic pulsation and of charge and discharge effectively. Basically, that's pretty much the issues that I wanted to put out there. We can talk more specifically about different aspects of this. I want to throw it to Dr. Schiff to see if he has any comments, and then take questions, which I think would probably be more playful. Maybe. We'll see. So if you're still there, or are you playing?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay.
Yes. Hello. Hello.
Can everyone hear?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. How much time do I have here?
Whatever, take what you need.
Think what I need?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, yeah, we'll stop you if you get to be too,
Right.
long.
Exactly. Okay. Let's see. I just like to come at this from a little bit of a different angle and build upon what Dr. Lewis is speaking.
Talk a little louder.
And build upon what you've been speaking about here. I was intrigued by the question, what is play? And I thought of it, and I thought the way the question was presented, and I thought about it, well, what is play if we ask that question trying to define play as a noun? But I wondered what it would be like to say, what is play if we think of play as a verb? To play. What is it to play? And in thinking about that, I thought that might be an easier question to answer. To really delve into what the experience is of play. And I was thinking that in that way, if we can kind of delve into or think, what is it to play? We might, each of us, think about different experiences that we have in which we play. And they would vary. Your experience, your situation, my situation would vary. And yet we might come to certain common ingredients that each of us share in terms of what is going on inside as we play. And that might bring us closer to the definition of play. And also might bring us closer to what Dr. Lewis is speaking about in terms of the bioenergetics or the energetics of play. So there's a very interesting book that I find interesting. It's by Jeffrey Masson, and it's called When Elephants Weep, The Emotional Lives of Animals. And he essentially makes the point, and I think a very good point, and maybe a point that fits well within an orgonomic framework and fits well with those of us who live or have lived with other animal species, that animals have emotional lives. And it's been somewhat difficult, as humans who tend to separate ourselves from the rest of life and think, well, we are unique, to sometimes look at animals and observe their behavior and observe what they're doing and say, well, they can't really be feeling emotion. But increasingly, and definitely as Mazan points out, there are those that say, yes, they do have emotional lives as well. And he has a very interesting few pages here on play, speaking about animals and play. And so what I'd like to do is just read a few little both segments in terms of his descriptions about play and give a feel about how animals play, which will seem very similar, just to give you a preview, to how we play. And then we can maybe move into kind of what is going on here. So he says, joy often expresses itself in play, which many animals indulge in all their lives. Play, which seems to be both a sign and source of joy, has been increasingly studied. I think in that sentence he captures something very important. Play and joy. And I think when we think of ourselves when we play, there is this experience of joy. As the play has been good, we felt good. So what is joy? What is joy as a feeling, and what is joy as an energetic expression, and what is joy emotion? So I want to now bring in some other area of interest that I've had for many years, and that's the increasing study or the building study in the field of psychology on the nature of emotions. And those of you who have heard me speak maybe around this before,
Talk a little louder.
those of you who have heard me speak about this before, I've made this comment that in psychology, for many years, the study of emotion was non-existent, probably similar to what Dr. Lewis is saying in terms of the study of play. And yet recently, and I would say within the past decade and a half, there has been an enormous growth and interest in the study of emotion, to the point now that it is being recognized that really it is our affect and our emotion that is more primary than cognition. And in a sense, it is our emotion upon which cognition then rides. So that fits very well within an orgonomic framework. So an aspect that they've been looking at in terms of emotion is the different kinds of emotion, what they call categorical emotions. What are their functions and what are their expressions? And it seems that when emotion researchers look at emotion, they seem to find, in terms of categorical emotions, which is anger, sadness, guilt, they seem to fear, they seem to study more what's called the negative emotions, or the survival emotions, versus that other set of emotions called the positive emotions. And there seem to be less of them. But ones that they have talked about are these emotions of positive emotions of interest, excitement, happiness, and joy. And they try to understand what function they have. It's very clear what the function of fear is, right? It alerts us to danger. It mobilizes a certain action, what they call an action tendency, to run. It mobilizes our cognitive function to be able to alert ourselves to danger. And without it, we would be lunch, at least at some point in our environment of evolutionary adaptation. In the earlier days, we would be lunch. Now we might be a smattering on the sidewalk or on the street. So it's very clear that that has a certain specific function, a certain specific direct goal in terms of motor movement, in terms of orientation. The same can be said for anger. The same probably can be said for guilt. The same could probably be said for sadness. And yet, for these other emotions, like joy, it becomes a little more difficult to say what exactly is being activated. What is the goal? What is the orientation? Which then brings us directly to what Dr. Lewis was saying. Play is not goal-directed. So there's this whole set of emotions that we have that fit with play and fit with this non-goal-directed, action tendency-oriented kind of idea which these other emotions have, and which move us, I would say, to play. So let me read you, this is from an article on, which is entitled, a very interesting
Louder.
title here. It's called what good are positive emotions? And it's not that early an article. It was written in 1998, essentially speaking about where the positive emotions fit in our understanding of the emotional life and emotions. And it's written here, joy is often used interchangeably with happiness and shares the conceptual space with other relatively high arousal positive emotions, such as elation, gladness. Feelings of joy arise in context appraised as safe and familiar. Think about that in terms of relationship to play now. When you play, what are the environments that you play in? Feelings of joy arise in context appraised as safe and familiar, as requiring low effort, and in some cases by events construed as accomplishments or progress towards one's goals. Offer the clearest statement on the action tendency, that means the motor movement associated with joy, which an author termed free activation. And he says, it is in part aimless, unasked for readiness to engage in whatever interaction presents itself, and in part readiness to engage in enjoyment. Now, I think that very closely describes what play is. He goes on, in other words, joy creates the urge to play, and to be playful in the broadest sense of the word, encompassing not only physical, but social play, and intellectual and artistic play. So, we have joy, which is a positive emotion, which leads to this kind of free activation, or in fact, I would say better, from an energetic perspective, is a free activation. A state of arousal, a state of heightened activation, which is free, expansive, rather than contracted, which expresses itself in a variety of different kind of activities, all which would be assumed under the word play. And we see that so much in animals, and I'll give a description here of animals. And then we see that in the human animal. And what's very fascinating to me is to observe how play varies and changes as children develop, and yet what is common to all those elements of play. So when you see the 2-year-old sitting on the floor, or the 1.5-year-old sitting on the floor and pounding something and making a lot of noise, and you, in my class when I'm teaching, I might have the 30-year-old coming and expressing some idea with vigor and interest and with a light in his or her eye. To me, those are not different activities. And if I could ask the 2-year-old or 1.5-year-old, what are you experiencing? Would you fill out this self-report form? And they filled it out. And if I could ask the 30-year-old, which I could, what are you experiencing in this moment? I would say there would be a high correlation between those experiences. In a sense, both would be experiencing what it feels like to be highly energized, highly activated in a free way, which gives a sense and reinforces a sense of pleasure. So, what does it look like in animals? Let me read you something, a description here. First of all, play, and this would be something that Dr. Lewis and I can discuss here, because play is not only, Dr. Lewis speaks about play in terms of helping us regulate our energy, and regulate our energy and become able to handle capacities of energy or pulsation with others. And I think that's directly, and that's very true. How also, play is not only with others. Play can be solitary, both for the human and for animals. And play, in that sense, also helps us tolerate and learn how to regulate energy, but regulate energy not not in the context of others. So let me give you a little quote here, or a little description of play that's done in solitude. And then this is my Masson again. Animals can play in complete solitude, he writes. Bears are playful throughout their lives and will slide on snowbanks like otters, head first, feet first, on the stomach, on the back, while somersaulting. Two grizzly bears in the Rockies were seen to wrestle for possession of a log. The bear who triumphed lay on its back and juggled the log on its feet while roaring with delight. A quieter grizzly floated on a mountain lake in a hot day. It ducked its muzzle beneath the water to blow bubbles, and then reached out to pop them with its long claws. Tiger cubs and leopards love to jump off branches into the water and will do so repeatedly. Bonobos in the San Diego Zoo play solitary games of blind man bluff. The bonobo covers its eyes with a leaf or bag, or simply puts its fingers or arms over its eyes and then staggers about the climbing frame. Another quote. Animals may also play with objects. This can be seen even with some animals that are not known to play with other animals. A captive Komodo dragon in the British Zoo played with a shovel, pushing it noisily about the enclosure. A meter-long wild alligator in Georgia spent 45 minutes playing with drops of water falling from a pipe into a pond, stalking the pipe, snapping at the drops, letting them fall in his snout, and then snapping at them in midair. For other animals, object play quickly becomes social play. So we see different kinds of expressions of play in animals. And those descriptions, which may be hard to capture when it's being read to you, but if you're with those descriptions of animal play are so similar to what we see in human play.
Louder.
So similar to what we see in human play, and have, from this understanding, are expressions of this joy, which then lend itself to this kind of motor and then social behavior.
If
Last point I want to make is that in terms of going back to play and the expressions of play in the human being, or in animals, I would propose this. I would propose that play is an expression of joy. Joy is energetic expansion. Joy is the experience of energetic expansion. Play emerges from joy. Play in its expression then, and in its use and function, then has evolved to serve us in different ways. And so play between animals has social functions. It serves to learn how to get along socially. We learn how to get along socially. It expands our cognitive capacities. We learn how to engage in this environment. All of these ride on the piggyback upon the expansion and the emotion and the action of play. And as we, as human animals, mature, our play takes different functions. It's very early a very motor play, and then it becomes a symbolic play, and then a socio-dramatic play, and then it becomes a more organized play in middle childhood, and then it becomes a more intellectual kind of play or abstract play in adolescence and adulthood. And these modes of play do not replace one another, but build upon one another. And increasingly, as that happens, as we become more sophisticated, are the variances of those play, the play changes. So we have far more flexibility in our repertoire of play. But at the basis of all of this is this energetic joy, expansion, etc. One last point. Dr. Lewis mentioned or gave an example in terms of, I think he was mentioning about sociopaths and in terms of that they do not show a history of play. And then it was brought up, I think, or mentioned in terms of these individuals having been abused or hurt or whatever. it is very clear from those individuals who work with children in play therapy or any kind of settings, that the nature of a child's play, of a child that has been abused, hurt, is in a fearful state, has been traumatized, that the nature of their play is not playful. Okay? It doesn't have the same quality, the same feeling, the same expression on the outside of a play of a child that is relaxed and happy and joyful. So we might say the child is playing in their repetitive, ongoing kind of mechanical way in which they might, take if they're a small child, take an animal, like a pretend animal, like a dinosaur or something, and continually want to beat on and eat up another dinosaur and do this repetitively again and again and again, demonstrating feelings of aggression and anger.
Or a real animal.
Aggression and anger, which Reich might speak of as those emotions coming from this secondary layer, which is built in because of their armoring and because of what they've experienced, that play is mechanical, is repetitive, and has the nature of what we define play as free-flowing, as spontaneous, as expansive, rather than contracted and narrow. Clearly, then, that play does not come from joy. And increasingly, within the clinical setting, it is very clear that as these children are able to undo the trauma, their play, the freedom, the expansiveness of their play changes. The quality, the literal movement of their play changes from one that is a repetitive, mechanical, not playful play, to a play that is more the kind of play that as we imagine, what does it mean to play? That's what we think about. So I look forward to some questions and for both of us, and I hope this was added something. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Let me I want to, as you were talking, which I think is very, very useful as far as I was concerned, there's been a couple of things that I wanted to add or comment on, and each one seemed to be the first one I wanted to comment on, but then each one got stimulated by something else. Touching first, actually working backwards, on the last comment you made as to and I think I talked about a pathological or deformation of play, and I think that's important, is that when we see children who have been abused, or individuals particularly children who have been abused, or animals, you see this in zoos or other, even in nature, animals who have restricted lives in some ways, or where their organisms become restricted, you see a pathological deformation of the play impulse, and it raises for me the question of, again, what is play? Is the child who's picking up a live animal, not just a play animal, or a play animal, and going through repetitive, destructive, or violent, or sadistic behaviors, playing anymore? Well, obviously, in some way, I think we have to look at it functionally, again, from Reich's perspective. The functional identity between violent, sadistic, repetitive behaviors and joyous or expansive play behaviors are the fact that energy is moving, and the destructive behaviors are the result of blocks in some way, where the energy cannot express itself in a free, self-regulating, operative manner, pulsatory manner. In the pathological situation, it produces a kind of what literally Reich called, quoting Dr. Sobey, I've never found it in literature, but Dr. Sobey said Reich used to use the term, what he called jam fucking. I'm sure it sounds even more interesting in German.
I never wrote that down.
Yeah. But it's the idea of like wanting to get through. Very, very often we see this in dealing with the function of the orgasm, the individual who, rather than submitting to or surrendering to a tender embrace, has to jam through or push through in the impulse to break open, to explode, to get it out, to release. And I think what genuine play is then is the fact that this, in a sense, regulates itself and expands and pulsates and finds its expression spontaneously. And by spontaneous, I don't mean just at any moment, but spontaneously in the objects or individuals or circumstances that it uses. And one of the things that always fascinates me about play, and especially watching young children play, is that in lacking one stimulus or lacking one thing to play with, they'll find something else. It doesn't really matter. And then in some ways, the objects or circumstances of the play are almost irrelevant to the fact that I'm going to play no matter what. So if I can't find a way to get into it this way, I'll find a way to get into it, another way, and that the real function is to get into it and to get, into something that is excited, is exuberant, and is essentially pulsatory, and finally, I prefer the word pleasurable rather than joyous. I mean, but I think joyous is an interesting word. I was initially uncomfortable with Dr. Schiff's use of the word joyous because it tends to have such a sort of, broad, popular, almost new agey kind of, the joy of sex or something. But I think, as I started thinking about it, I think maybe there really is. And if you look at children or animals, we have a 2-year-old poodle, Sammy, who loves snow, and when he sees the snow, he just goes wacky. It's like, and his impulse is to leap and roll in it and stick his nose in it and jump in it and be shocked by it, and then go after it again, and just becomes totally wild. I mean, he does that in other ways too, but this is like unique, and this clearly, when you see that, and I think the tendency to anthropomorphize animals and say that's what we actually. It's clearly the way a child usually responds to snow. However, children who are more fearful and have suffered more often will respond to snow and things like that very, very frightened, very, very unsure, very uncomfortable. So I think it has a lot to do with this ability to experience the environment in a open, pulsatory manner. That isn't blocked, and I think the kind of repetitive and mechanical behaviors really aren't play, and that's the problem. They're attempts at using the behavioral systems that we identify as play to get someplace, but it's not working. So there's almost, if you watch children who get into repetitive play behaviors, sadistic or violent play behaviors, they're often very, very frustrated, very, very aggressive, very, very unsatisfying. There's very little pleasure, even in the act of hurting or breaking things. There's not great pleasure. I mean, there's some pleasure, there's some release, but it's not what they're really after. They're clearly after something else that they can't. And when a child, the classic, of course, is in human relationships is the boy, is the young boy who really has this great impulse towards the young girl, and what he does is he goes over and he pulls her hair, or he kicks her. Obviously it's not what he wants. He gets some sort of sadistic pleasure from it, but it's a substitute, it's a substitute pleasure which is in no way what the organism is really moving and reaching toward. So that was one comment, it seemed to me to be worth considering. The other thing is, it suddenly occurred to me that breastfeeding is a very interesting issue about what is play and what is not play. Okay? So that the baby instinctively, like the dog, knows in a nursing situation, the baby knows when it is nursing because it needs to relieve the tension of hunger. It also knows when it is nursing because the breast is the most fun thing to play with. and is going to give it the most pleasure. And mothers who nurse will know that and anyone who's watched nursing mother couples, babies and mothers, know that there are different kinds of nursing. I mean, and there's also nursing for a third kind of nursing, which is nursing for soothing, protective comfort. But distinctively, there is a kind of nursing that is not, and sometimes it flows between the behaviors. Sometimes it starts out as nursing for hunger, and then gradually it reaches a point where satiation has come and the baby is not sleepy yet, but wants to sort of interact with the breast as a play, in a play interaction, and will change the nature of its nursing behavior. So I think that very often in all behaviors that becomes a paradigm, which is play is one of those things that often moves into other aspects of our interaction with the environment, and it has a morphing quality, to use, I guess, pop culture, morphing creatures and stuff like that. But it does morph. It does have a metamorphic potential for becoming. We see this in children constantly, and animals, where there's play. They start. I've even thinking of my dog. My dog will pick up one of his toys, and he's clearly just having a good, grand, funny, happy time playing with it, right? But will suddenly become quite intent and serious, as if there's something he has to do with this that's no longer just about playing, about having a expansive, happy romp, right? And where it changes is very hard. And to say that no, it's still play is not the same, because he's clearly focused. His body becomes different, and so I think there are these qualities that we often miss about play, is that they often morph and have a protean and volatile quality, which, if one thinks of it energetically, makes sense, because energy it does not move in a highly structured, highly organized way. Part of the problem is that what our task is, as we move into more social and more task-oriented life experiences, is that we then have to learn how to use these kinds of qualities and behaviors to engage in task-oriented behavior. So that's why I think, in light of what Dr. Schiff was saying, that as we get older, the play changes, and play in older children or now in adults begins to have more task-oriented, more defined roles, and often begins to cover more task-centered, work-like relationships, or socially defined role relationships. So that, and then you begin to get things like, I know there are a number of people involved in theater here and such, and that you get into more organized, theater activities where there's an element of play, and you can use play in theater to explore, intent, explore movement, to explore a lot of aspects, but the goal is not to just be playful. The goal is to begin to use it to shape a more defined function or defined situation. So I think that's also something important. The other, I guess, final comment I wanted to make was that it seemed to me that one of the reasons it's hard to define play is that it probably should be hard to define play. Is that by its very nature, it's probably something that shouldn't be easily defined, because it is a pervasive energetic function. That it is a specific kind of function that has a very volatile, very, very, non-structured quality, and serves many and varied functions in our organism. So in a sense, that one of the things that we invariably do, particularly in the social sciences or the sciences, is say, okay, let's define this. Let's really come and understand this. Well, it's possible that one of the worst things you can do about play is to really understand it. It might be worth studying, but that there is some definitive and final understanding about it that will say, okay, now we got play. Here, we can put it on, here's the definitive text on play, and, and that's it. is probably counter to exactly what play is, and so I think that's something I think has to be kept constantly, for me anyways, in the background. So that's my comments, unless you have another comeback on that, or we can go to questions or
Well,
comments.
why don't we open it up?
Okay,
I had two images
Right.
coming through all this. One was-
loud, so he
I
can.
had two images. One was superimposition,
Mhm.
and modification of that is you can superimpose not just with another entity or object, but
Right.
also you can, in a sense, you can superimpose with yourself.
Mhm.
And the other was Bruegel's Children of Play, where everything is in motion, there's constant bubbling going on. And I think that this is without thought.
Right.
Thought comes out of it afterwards.
Right.
And it's not teleological at all, it's just functional.
I think that's a very, very good point, that idea that it's without thought, that actually one of the greatest, if you want to really feel like a fool, most of us have at different times, is ask your kids or kids that you know when they're playing what they're doing. They'll just sort of look at you, as if, you're like the biggest idiot in the world, and it's like, not that you're an idiot because you don't know what they're doing, but it's you're an idiot that the question has no meaning in the context of what they're doing, because exactly as you say, it's not about an organized meaning, it's about what it is.
There's one other thing. A lot of play, a little bit with all the children, there can be an idea beginning the play activity to an objective thing, but once that gets started,
Right.
it's free flowing.
Right. I mean, what I think Dr. Schiff pointed out, the object that one chooses or the situation that one chooses is only an excuse. It's simply to get, it's to get things going. I mean, and this raises really serious questions. For instance, is playing with a PlayStation or a video game play?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, but what's interesting is when adults play, right, with video, and that might be interesting to look at. When adults play with video stations, it tends to be very, very ocular, very, very focused, very, very rigid. Children, I notice, when I watch my daughter and her friends play video games, tend to be much, much more physical. There's a lot more movement. There's a lot less focus strictly on the screen. Although, as they get older, it begins to become, because the nature of what they're using, or the nature of the device is such that you can't really be running around the room and playing that way. And so it's interesting what kind of games. It also keeps running in my mind the question of, is sports, is baseball, basketball, highly structured sports games, is that play?
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe it is, but is it? Again, I mean, I'm not giving a definitive answer. Obviously, we have, this is a big question, but Jim.
It may depend on how it's played.
All right,
You can play baseball or you can be compulsive.
all right. It could become.
It's also cultural,
Right.
because you can look back at the Mexicans in Monte Albano, they were playing games
Right.
that were equal, but a lot of it comes later. It seems
Right.
from what you're saying, very early on, it's all very human. If we're talking about from the breast on,
Right.
that's very basic to all animals.
Right.
And play, and then when does it change?
Right.
When does it
That's a good question. When, and probably something, if one is going to set up a full project to study play, or a full proposal to look at play, is what, we passed quickly over this, and Dr. Schiff even said, then gradually it becomes more structured and play changes. But I think that's a broad and very interesting area of investigation. When does it change? How does it change? And what is the meaning of that change? And when we look at different societies, what is the purpose of that change? If you have societies that in Reich, while again, and I didn't address that, while Reich doesn't talk at any place that I know specifically about the nature and function of play. I mean, there's some allusion to it. Neil does, and Neil, A.S. Neil clearly talks about play as the place where the child. That's the child's work. That's the child's, place of learning and engaging and operating. And at some point, if you're in a society that's more compulsive, then and since work is going to have to be compulsive, right? and since your love life is going to have to be compulsive in some way, then play at some point has to be encouraged or organized to move from a spontaneous, self-regulating, basically focused, just expression of joy or emotion to a more organized, task-oriented, compulsive. And maybe now as I'm talking, it even answers, one of the things that organized sports does is present you with, or video games with specific rules, or board games with specific structured rules is it begins to give you that kind of structuring and an avenue for building greater compulsion, and then add to that large amounts of money that can be earned.
Why do you call it compulsion?
You're locked in.
Why do you call this compulsion? There's a difference between compulsiveness and activity. An organization doesn't have to be compulsive.
That's right, but at some point, it seems to me that what starts out as let's get together and organize a game of baseball can at some point in some various situations begin to take on elements of compulsivity that are socially determined.
And exclude the weaker players.
Whether they become highly competitive, whether they become goal-directed in terms of achieving awards,
That's when it becomes a substitute.
Yes, but in some way, there are societies that don't have that kind of competitive play, and that where play, even though it becomes more organized socially. For instance, Bush, in terms of my anthropological background, Bush children learn how to play. They don't play competitive games. What they do, their games, which have to do, say, with hunting, and tracking, become gradually, they start out as fairly independent, rather, just whatever happens to be around the environment. Gradually they become more organized and begin to work in groups, but they become highly cooperative, and they become highly oriented towards how we as a group track or hunt or operate. So you're moving there towards a society that's not compulsive, that's structured. I mean, the difference is, I'm not talking about the difference between, all social function has to become structured, so everyone has to essentially grow into and accept the structures of the social environment they live in. If you happen to be growing into a society that's highly compulsive and operates in a compulsive frame, then obviously play becomes the avenue by which you're going to begin to be trained and adapted to being comfortable in those kinds of behaviors. And I think that's the other crucial element here, is that what most play researchers seem to, in serious play research, seem to agree on, is that play in some way stimulates and prepares the organisms for the things, or for the behaviors, or for the organized behaviors that are necessary to achieve adult reproductive and productive life in some way. Yeah.
I have a question about that. The whole definition of task-oriented and creative process can so shift based on the society.
That's
and
right.
Based on the ability to contract and expand.
Right. I think that's
So
true.
I'm a little wary of.
Right. No, it's dangerous to make this mechanical, but I think that there are societies that encourage playfulness and encourage creativity because it's going to become more and more a part of the way you engage the world as adults, as what I would call productive and reproductive members of the group. There are societies which really, in some sense, want to restrict your independent behavior because it works contrary to what the society needs. As Reich points out very clearly, if you're going to grow up to be a factory worker who has to do incredibly repetitive behaviors with very, very little gratification, you're not going to be encouraged to play games or to engage in more deeply pleasurable activities, including sexual play, which is a big part of play, that are going to be contrary to spending hours and hours and hours in these kinds of compulsive, repetitive behaviors. So that the society, I think societies instinctively, based on their nature, know how to use the key device, which is, I think that becomes the place I started, that play is a central expression in the organism, in any, not human, but any organism, of the way you're going to engage your environment. It's the way into engagement with the environment. It's a way to take that natural pulsation and place it in the environment that it has to interact with. And so depending on how you want to direct that will affect how the organism, how flexible, how mobile the organism becomes.
But because of theories like the chaos theory, which I have like a Jackie Kennedy mentality,
Yeah.
and I'm an expert on it. But the idea of lack of, that there's so much undefined in play that even that factory situation in another society or with a catastrophe, or that someone might come up with, or a culture that's not plagued might come up with another way of doing it that is extended from early play, the ability to early play.
Well, I mean, I think it does become, it is an extension of early impulses in play, except that essentially it goes back to a deformity or a restriction on those natural patterns. So, I mean, all children know, all organisms play repetitively. You know, I mean, repetitive play. I mean, we all know we've all had children. You know, or many of us have been. All of us have been children. We've all been around children. You know, we know the concept. Let's do it again. I want to do it again, over and over and over again, so that it produces repetitiveness. Is a very real part of play. The question is what the function of that repetitiveness is. If the function of that repetitiveness becomes purely no longer involves pleasure, but involves a task and a product, you know, a production, then it takes on a different nature. And again, coming back to what Dr. Schiff was saying, if it no longer involves joy, if it no longer involves an enhancing or a engaging of the expansive experience, that I mean, it's no different in sexuality. We know that if you can have a fully, you know, open and freer sexual interaction, it's pleasurable. But many sexual behaviors, which are exactly the same as free and open sexual behaviors, can easily become compulsive, you know, deadening, objects of what we have to do. You know, performances and such, so that it's lost. So I think the issue is to distinguish these things is a mistake. They are part. There's a continuum there, and I think the issue of how various situations and social groupings respond to that is very important, as well as individuals in particular settings. So children, there's a lot of interesting data on children who are raised in real isolation, who don't ever really have social play, who develop private play, but there are interesting insights into, and Dr. Schiff mentions the issue of solitary play, which is important, but I would argue, in everything I've read, that solitary play is only significant in a healthy way when it leads to the ability of the organism to also engage in interpersonal play in other situations. So bears, who are a very interesting phenomenon, because bears are solitary creatures. They spend the majority of their life alone. So they have a great deal of, just sort of romping through the wilderness, sliding, playing, rolling. But what happens is when they do interact socially, right, those same behaviors tend to be operative at times when social play, when social interaction is allowed. I mean, there are times when they'll do and they won't do it. But two male bears coming together at the wrong time, it's no longer play. Although the elements of their warfare or their combat might well have play elements in it. And I think that the other aspect of interesting study is that these behaviors that often are play, and that comes back to Bateson's insight of that the dogs know, so that when two dogs come at each other and display behaviors that look like they're going to be tearing each other's throat out, but they know it's not that, it's play, versus at times when it isn't play, and and yet the behaviors are not that dissimilar. It strikes me always of the interesting, we know orgonomically, the interesting physiological phenomena that laughter and crying are physiologically identical. There is no difference physiologically in terms of the muscles, the function of crying, physiologically, anatomically and physiologically is identical to laughter. And yet, of course, emotionally, and circumstantially they're very different. Why and how? And obviously some of it's situational, some of it's internal. I mean, that's a whole other, maybe I should do a lecture on crying and laughing, but it is, these are interesting phenomena, and I think when we study play, we have to look at these issues about, and that probably what is often confusing is that so much of what goes on is so embedded in the variety of human and animal experiences that it's very, very hard to distinguish one behavior and say that's, you see, that's play, but that's not, and I think that becomes difficult.
In our culture, the person who is most admired and devalued is the artist, who very often is described as an adult who is able to be playful and bring that child, in quote, quality to their work, in that they're still in touch with that ability to take a chance to enjoy
and often suffer and suffer because they are not seen, and that now of late artists are given more value to the extent that they're successful. So that if you become phenomenally wealthy, phenomenally successful, phenomenally celebrated, then obviously you're a wonderful successful person. Except to do that kind of for your art to achieve that as an artist has to do with learning other things other than being a creative, pleasurably creative.
I'm just curious for people who've had children recently. They say, let's do it again. I assume to have the same pleasurable experience. When does it become compulsive? Or how? Or does it become
for the adult, it becomes compulsive about the second or third time.
But then is the child doing it to get at the adult?
But
Obviously,
the issue is, in most children, it's fairly playful, and it's just a desire because they're enjoying the process. At what point the child realizes that it's getting to the adult, and the adult is getting irritable, and then the child does it to get a certain, pleasure out of, driving the adult crazy. That has much more to do with the interpersonal dynamic. Repetition of a favorite story, wanting to read a story over and over again, clearly has a clear energetic function, it seems to me, in that the child simply is getting, when you read Dr. Seuss for the 40th time because the kid wants to go over it, to you it's like, oh my God, I can't do this again. For the child, what we've lost contact with, for the child, ordinarily, unless there's some other dynamic going on, the child is actually learning something new each time. There's more there for it, because what we miss often is, it was always, one of the things I always come back to, and maybe this is also very valuable for discussion on play, is the fascinating reality that in the first year of life, right, you as an organism will learn more than you will learn for the rest of your life. The total quantity of learned and gained knowledge is massive, right, compared to what you will learn from then on. And so I think what we often miss in children is that what they're doing is not repeating. So that when the child, in a healthy circumstance, forget, that it's a conflict with the parent or an attempt to drive the parent or adult crazy. In a healthy situation, what the child is doing, the child's agenda is not repetition. I mean, it's repetitive, but is that there's more to hear, there's more to learn. We know that as adults. We know that there are plays. The problem is Dr. Seuss doesn't have that kind of depth for us anymore, that there's like still 20 or 30 levels of understanding. But there certainly any one of us knows, whether it's reading Reich or reading Shakespeare or seeing a dance that you've seen maybe 20 or 30 times repeated, or a play that you've seen before, that there are levels, and that if it's really good, that there are levels of that the repetition isn't really repetitive. It's opening up more access.
Well, then the 20th time it's a compliment to your reading.
Yeah, that too. It could be.
I've one other thing. Relationship of joy to inquiry and investigation. Children,
louder so Dr. Schiff can hear if we haven't driven them away yet.
Animals play and they inquire and they investigate interchangeably with the motor activity. They go around trying to find out everything, and it's a form of, I don't know if it's a form of play, but it's so closely related to it because they can go from one to the other instantly.
I think that's a good point too. I think clearly one of the things we didn't discuss here, and I think it's valuable, at least it strikes me what you're saying, is that there are a number, as John Bowlby often points out, that when you're looking at behavioral systems, and play is certainly a behavioral system, but you're often looking at constellations of behaviors that serve many functions. And clearly, when we look at play, some of the behaviors that go on are very distinctively involved in exploratory systems of behavior. So exploration is a very active part of play. Physical, muscular exercise is a very active part of play. Curiosity, which is related to exploratory play. The experience, and Dr. Schiff made a very good point, is that it's also a place to practice emotions, right? So if I watch my dog, he'll go through a range of, he'll play with like one of his toys when he's like tearing at it, and sometimes it's clearly just totally happy, fun, and all of a sudden he'll get very angry, and I'm gonna, and then he'll go from that to like fear, literally, like he's pushing away, and you get this clear sense that what he's doing is practicing. He's accessing and moving through a range of emotions that are going to be valuable, and that are necessary in terms of what he has to do in engaging behavior. To end on that, from my perspective, is that back in the 60s, one of the values of the beginning of play research produced was that when Jane Goodall and others, Diane Fossey and others, began to study Urban DeVore out in looking at baboons, at orangutans, began to study them, and what began to become clear is that and then connecting that to Harry Harlow's work with macaws, rhesus monkeys rather, that animals that don't play never learn to be sociable, and the key thing that they never learn to do is to deal with natural sexual function. So that one of the big mysteries always was why you couldn't reproduce in zoos, why animals, that never seemed to be, and the panda you didn't worry about because pandas have a hard time reproducing in nature. They're just very peculiar creatures. But in general, animals that ordinarily would have no difficulty reproducing, that had no particular quirks to the reproductive process, could not reproduce in zoos. It was a major, major problem until these in environmental studies of animals in nature showed that when animals socialize, they learn how to have relationships with other animals, including sexual relationships, and they learn how to be, how to give, how to be parents. And without that, they can't do it. So lo and behold, when they began to create these environments in zoos, in zoological settings, right, reproductivity in captivity became no longer a great hazard. If anything, they're developing overpopulations and being able to re-establish many of these species in nature. But clearly it comes out of the ability to play and its social functions. If you have anything are you following or?
Excuse me?
Are you following or?
I'm following. Yeah, I do have a comment on, it was a very interesting discussion on the difference between compulsive activity and repetition.
Right.
And clearly they're different. If for all of us, I think most of us have done some compulsive behaviors, and maybe others who engage in more compulsive behaviors. When that's happening, clearly one is not having fun. They would not characterize themselves as they're doing it and they're enjoying it. Whereas repetitious behavior that has to do with play, one continues to have fun. And there's something about something being repetitious, like if you look at the infant doing the peekaboo game, and they do it again and again. The whole nature of that, where there's an expectation, an excitement, a build-up, and then a discharge, when what is being expected emerges again and again and again, which goes through kind of a mini kind of cycle of tension charge, discharge, relaxation, that is energetically moving, that is exciting, that is fun, and that's why the infant wants to do it again and
Absolutely.
and again and again and again.
Absolutely. I think we don't look enough also, say, when we talk about reading Dr. Seuss for the 50th time, it's often about how you're reading Dr. Seuss. Usually what's happening in the reading, it's not the parent or the adult saying, okay, you sit here, I'll read it to you. The child doesn't want that. What the child really wants is to cuddle with you, is to roll on the bed with you, is to read it, or is to play with the book. And there's a lot of physical activity. I guarantee you, if you try to sit a child down who wants you to read it again, say, you sit at that end of the table, and I'll sit here and I'll read it to you. Or you sit out there and I'll read it to you. They're not going to have the least bit of interest. So I think what Dr. Schiff is saying is absolutely on the mark. And the other thing is the issue of disengaging behavior. In other words, one of the things that happens is behaviors are activated and deactivated. What is often happening is when the child activates a behavior like a particular repetitive play, our level of toleration is like, okay, we're ready to, after a couple times to deactivate. The play is done, it's fine. I don't really want to do this anymore. I'm finished with it. The child is not finished with it yet. But if you really deal with a child or a dog or any other kind of a cat, even though it seems endless that they're willing to play endlessly, it's not true. Children will go through, given free range, will go through a range of repetitions, and at some point they'll say, okay, that's it. I'm going over here. It deactivates. And what that means is that the reason it's repeating is, as Dr. Schiff is saying, is that there's still something to get out of it that's still pleasurable, and when that's finished, they'll move on. And similarly, it's the same thing with the dog, and similarly, in any of these behaviors. But what happens is when you get, two kids playing, we'll go through that. It's interesting, you'll see even with young children, though, when they start playing socially, one really wants to keep going because they haven't gotten enough out of it. The other kid hasn't. So what they do is say, I don't want to do that anymore. I'm going here. Sometimes there's conflict over that, but sometimes it just, they move off. But we usually as adults don't have the patience to wait that long. I mean, it's consistent, say, with the famous anecdote of A.S. Neal, who was very good at that, right? Of the kid who wanted to break windows with rocks, and so Neal got, told him, well, your parents are going to have to pay for all the windows. It's like, okay. As Neal said, they were rich families, so it didn't matter. So he got a whole bunch of rocks, and he's had the kid throw the rocks at the windows. And now most of us would get to the point of saying, after he broke the 10th window, like, God, got to stop this kid. This is ridiculous. Neal just kept going, and finally the kid got to the point of saying, this is no fun. Well, I'm finished with it, and he stopped breaking. He didn't have to break. But the point is, most of us don't have that patience, that ability. And maybe we don't have to. I mean, it's not. I think part of us gets into, particularly people coming from the kind of work that we're mostly involved with, is we feel that we should have that kind of patience, and we should be, infinitely, and that what that produces is another kind of message, which is we're reading it for the 50th time, but we resent it, at some level, and the kid picks up on that.
I don't bring two things up.
Louder, so Dr.
Two
Schiff.
things. Did you ever have a kid who wanted green eggs and ham every morning for about a month and forget about it? Then they go away. But what mainly I want to is the word instinct, the concept instinct, which is so ambiguous and difficult, and it's a fallback all the time. But instinct is central to this. And I don't know what instinct really is, except I see it all the time.
Yeah, well, the argument of what instincts...
Play is instinctual.
Well, I mean, I think the problem... Yeah, the problem is the word instinct implies some sort of primitive behavior or some sort of... I mean, basically, I think, as you're saying, it's drive. It's basically, I think we get away from that by going to the understanding of it being energetic, and that it's a natural function of the organism to expand and contract, and that pulsation is not instinctual, it's inherent. I mean, I prefer the word inherent. It comes with the organism. It's like, you don't look at an amoeba pulsating and moving in its environment saying it's instinctual. You say it's basically functioning naturally. It's natural function. Instinct implies that it is that there are drives and functions that we have no control over. But in fact we do. The interesting thing about the child who wants repetition is the child has very active control. The problem is what the child is attempting to control is the behavior and enjoying the behavior and using it until he or she is finished with it. What we have the problem with is that we don't want to do it that much, so we're saying, stop. And the child's saying, well, why should I stop? I'm not finished with it yet. Yeah.
Harry,
Yeah.
I just want to, maybe this is backing up too much and it's too general, but what I heard is a little bit of a contradiction, or I'm just confused about, I heard Daniel say that very clearly what play is, and maybe it's the verb-noun thing, and you're saying that you can't define it. And
Well, I think you can define it. I don't think you can give a dictionary definition. I don't think you can give a finite definition. And I think that part of what the definition of play is that it's a highly varied, range of expression based on an essentially simple fundamental aspect of the organism's function. That the definition for me is that the central function of play is regulation of energy, okay? And as such, then everything else becomes ways in which that energy expresses itself in a variety of ways, and that in the healthiest circumstance, it's allowed to play out and discover the variety of expressions. And that ideally, if we can allow children to do that, they explore the world, or animals explore the world that way, and learn. And they also make mistakes, and they learn. And that's part of what I think the function of play is. I think then it's not so much defining play. I think that's easier than understanding the function and the range and varieties of play. I think maybe there's another area that one should talk about in terms of the variety of play. Do you have any comment?
As a noun.
Well, I think we're kind of narrowing in on, which we shouldn't be doing when we're talking about play, but we're narrowing in on really that the underlying essence is this kind of energetic expansiveness, which we experience in a certain way. This recruits a number, and I think Dr. Lewis is bringing this in terms of an orientation. It recruits many behavioral systems. It recruits many different expressions because of the nature that it's expansive. So we have so many different ways of playing, of being in play, and then so many different kind of functions that play seems to then serve. Just by its nature, that is this expansive kind of energetic expression. So we do have that within the human animal, we learn social skills, we learn cognitive skills, we learn personal skills, we learn self-regulatory skills. So much. It's amazing, isn't it, in some way, that so much of what we learn and how we grow is served by play. And that again, going back and repeating myself, that again sits upon this basic, energetic, expansatory process, and this process of energetic pulsation, where play, we get excited, we have some resolution, we discharge, we engage it again, and we want to have this natural repetition, which moves us and then serves the purpose of mastery in all these different kind of levels. And then, of course, society then puts its restrictions on it and says this play is right, this play is wrong, this play is correct, incorrect, and that leads to then kind of structuring and possibly making things compulsive. But, that's the cultural kind of overpinning on it.
And Reich, I think, would say, or has said that society does that, or we said authority does that to control society.
Yeah. Uh-huh. Well, it depends on how it's done.
Right.
Society per se.
It's like having children sit in their seats. I mean, we've gone over this at other symposiums, having children sit in their seats in first grade and second grade, which immobilizes their energy and restricts their play. That is not necessary for their learning. So that's an artificial cultural kind of armoring kind of constriction. But there are other ways that society can organize and help direct that it does not impair the energetic function, and in fact supports it.
Well, I think that's enough. Let's go play.
Yes, I was just thinking, we need a dog now.
But thank you
Thank you. Have a good day, everyone.
You have anything? You have anything to add?
To you.
Hello?
What?
You have anything else?
That's it. No, I've said my piece.
How's the weather out there?
Weather, it's actually foggy out. It's going to be the last nice weekend, and then we're expecting the rain, which we have not had, let me say, for many a month.
Okay, good luck.
Okay.
See you. Okay, so that's the end of the series for the spring, for the fall, winter. If you're not on my mailing list yet, our mailing list yet, give me your address and I'll put you on our mailing list. If you haven't paid me in advance or need to pay me now, do so.
Yes,
by play. It's pay by pay.
I am.
Give me like 15
Yes,
minutes.
it's
It's been a couple of years.
I've been in